Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Maria Llanos. I am with the NCEO, and we are joined by Mike, who is going to be our presenter today. We have a lot of great stuff to get through in this hour. We're going over strategic roadmap for a CEO transition. So as everybody kind of joins us here, maybe grabs their lunch if it's lunchtime, maybe a coffee if it's breakfast still for you. I will go over some housekeeping pieces so everyone feels comfortable with how today will flow. So, as always, we shout out our sponsors. We do these webinars almost every Tuesday, and the sponsors are the ones that are here with us, putting out the content for you all and creating such a wonderful learning community. So, as always, thank you there. We have these webinars, like I said, almost every Tuesday, and these are free with your NCEO membership. But if you have questions about that membership, you need to renew or anything else, this contact information will be your golden ticket. As for questions today, if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a feature called Q&A. Questions are welcome, and please feel free to submit those at any point. We're both going to do our best to make sure that we're catching those questions and answering them appropriately. So you'll type in your question there, submit it, and it'll come through to us. We'll make sure we answer it. The only thing I'll share is that raised hand feature you see is something we're not able to address or call on you, but we do want to hear from you. So please just go ahead and type those questions there. Moving on, today's session is eligible for generic and SHRM CE credit. To do and achieve that credit, you'll need to do two things. So the first, we'll have three polling questions today. You'll see those come up throughout the presentation. If you're joining from a mobile device and you have any trouble seeing those polling questions, you can send me a message. But as long as you answer all three of those polling questions, you'll be good to go, and then you just have to stay for the full duration of the webinar. So any questions about that, you can send me a message, you can email here, we'll get you squared away. And then the slides are live for you. If you'd like to follow along, you can download those on our page. We will put the replay on that same page and send both of those out in a follow-up email, so you have access to those if you need to go back and rewatch. Last but not least, I'll say a few things about what we've got coming up. This Thursday, we've got a community conversation. It's a webinar, but it's free to everyone. You don't have to have an NCEO membership to join. So it's a really great opportunity to expand our community and share that learning. And then we have a webinar next week on valuation. These are our upcoming in-person events. Those all live on our page, and there's lots of information about those, but I can help anybody with their registration or other questions they might have about the conference, the forum, or any of our workshops. So I will pass it back. I will be here to support and help, and we will let Mike take it away.
Thank you, Maria. Hopefully I've done this correctly. We have this up. As Maria said, my name is Mike Frommelt. I am from Strategic Talent Partners, and Strategic Talent Partners is a talent strategy firm. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but we work with ESOPs all across the country. And what we do for ESOPs is executive recruiting. We recruit for all levels of leadership, from manager up to CEO. We also do board director searches as well. And then we also provide some consulting around, sort of wrapped around that hiring process and so forth, things like role definition, assessments, succession planning, and then what we're going to talk about today, which is CEO transition planning. So I have myself been involved with CEOs, CEO transition, and working with ESOPs for about 25 years. And I've seen a lot of CEO transitions during that time. I've been involved in a number of them myself, and have seen many others. And so I've sort of seen the good and the bad and the ugly as it relates to CEO transition. And about 5 years ago, I sat down and thought about all the best transitions that I've been involved in and had seen, and developed this transition roadmap. And so this is what I'm going to use today as kind of a framework to walk through to talk about the CEO transition process. And what this really represents is sort of if you could do everything perfectly at just the right time, all the right activities at just the right time. Now, with all the transition processes that I've been in, I've never seen one that's gone perfectly. And so, perfectly according to the script. Every company is different. Every CEO is different. Different situations and scenarios. So I don't worry if you're in a transition process and you have skipped one of these steps or done things in reverse order or what have you. I'm not putting this out there to scare anybody. You're not headed for disaster if you don't follow everything according to the script. But what I will say is that as you go through these processes, you will face all of these things, all of these activities will happen. And whether or not you are prepared for them and have them well thought out, you're going to, and how you execute on them will ultimately, play into the success of that transition as you go. Okay. So I'm going to go through each stage of the transition roadmap here, and we are definitely open to questions as we go here. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to provide those questions. But before I jump into the kind of each piece of the roadmap, I want to make some comments just about how these processes are driven and who's responsible for these processes. So first and foremost, it's really important to understand that it's a board thing. It's a board responsibility. If you go out and you did a Google search like I did here and asked what is the biggest things for a board to do in a company, you'll see some quotes like this. The most important job of a board is hiring the CEOs, to choose the CEO. CEO succession is the number one role of the board. And a change in the CEO is one of the most crucial events in the life of your company. So I have actually seen this in real life in terms of seeing companies that have not done these transitions well, and they're either no longer in business or maybe no longer in ESOP. And so if you think about how tied in your CEO is to your employee owners, to your customers, to your suppliers, your vendors, your community, all those kind of things. When you go through a change like this, it's a big deal. And so, doing it in a seamless manner as possible is going to benefit the business, benefit the ESOP, and make sure that the ESOP continues to keep going in the right direction, which is growing. There are other roles, certainly, and I should say that when you ultimately do choose a CEO, that's going to be a board vote. So again, a full board decision, and you're going to go around the table and say we want this person to be our CEO or not. And so it's a full board decision. Some of the other key roles, the outgoing and retiring CEO, will also have a key role. However, their role is going to be more consultative and developmental along the way. Now, most of the retiring CEOs, at least the ones that I've worked with, are also serving on the board. So they have sort of dual hats that they're wearing as they go through this process. Your service providers will also have some specific things, some specific to-dos along the way. Things that you'll ask of your trustees or your accountants or your attorneys, et cetera. And also your human resources department should be involved in these processes, and their role is really one of coordination and also developmental, and I will describe what that means as we go here today. But one of the key things that I want to make very clear is that, again, that it's a full board decision. And so when I have seen succession transition processes not go well, oftentimes it's been because the outgoing CEO is sort of handpicking their successor and without input from the board or from others. And so it's really important that you understand the full board needs to be involved in these processes and driving these processes. Is there any questions so far? I feel like I've kind of thrown a lot at you already. Anything that anyone would like to ask?
It looks like Susanna asked a question in the chat about the CEO and how common it is for them to be on the board.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch all that. The CEO and
How common it is for them to be
oh,
on board.
oh. Um, I would say that generally the CEO is on the board. I would say it's probably 90% of the situations I've seen is where the CEO is on the board. I think you're asking about the CEO that's the outgoing CEO. Um, if you're talking about the CEO that would be coming in, I've seen that probably be 50-50 as to whether or not they are immediately on the board of directors. Um, but generally, there's a plan for them to be on the board of directors within 6 months to a year. Good question. Any others? Okay.
One from Chris, can the outgoing CEO stay on the board after they transition out? I think you touched on that a little bit, but
Yeah, another good question. And yes, oftentimes that is the case. And again, depends a little bit on the situation. Sometimes if it's an outgoing CEO that was also a former owner, they will stay on the board. They're oftentimes they will have a note or warrants that will, so they have a vested interest and they will stay on the board. Um, Oftentimes as well, an outgoing or retiring CEO, even if it's not an owner, will stay on the board of directors. But that is a decision that, again, the board of directors needs to make as a whole, needs to be discussed and make that decision based on the situation. So, okay. So in this 4 to 5 years out from the actual transition, and sometimes this raises some eyebrows when I say 5 years out from the transition to get started with these processes. But the very first thing that you need to do is to make sure that you have a well-functioning board of directors. So I just said how important it is that the board of directors is driving these processes. It only makes sense then that you have a real strong board of directors. What that means, in my opinion, I think it's important that you have outside or independent board directors on your board. I've been involved in situations where it's an all internal board, and if you can think about it, an all internal board, then in choosing a CEO is really all choosing their boss, and can be very, very difficult situation to go through. It can become very political and very difficult process. So having independent board directors, I think, is really important. I have seen organizations that have an all internal board of directors that then will actually create a committee and bring some independent folks to a succession or transition committee as well. And maybe they're not full board directors, but they are involved in the transition process. So having those independent voices, again, experienced, usually what those board directors are going to be is a CEO, either retired or active, or a CFO, retired or active from other companies. And they provide a lot of great input into the process. Okay. It's also important at this point that you sort of get your governance structure in place and or make sure that it's up to date. Oftentimes I come into an organization and I'll say, can I see your bylaws? And especially if it's a mature ESOP, they'll say, let me go look for those and, find that they're 20 years out of date. So having your bylaws in place and up to date, and maybe you're already doing things that are kind of going against your bylaws as you wrote them way back when you transacted to an ESOP. Your articles of incorporation, sort of your guidelines, and then a set of expectations for your board directors. So especially if you're bringing in new independent directors onto the board, what are the expectations of a board director at our organization? What do we expect of them? And then what can they expect back from us as well? I also think this is an important time to create a board review process because, again, the importance of that board and the strength of your governance. So having a process that is looking at on a yearly basis, is that director providing the value that they're supposed to be providing, and vice versa as well. So having kind of a review process year over year to talk about the board directors and the structure of the board. Okay. So ideally to have, especially if you're bringing in some new board directors or revamping your board in some way, giving them a year or so, or a year and a half to really kind of get a rhythm and start working together and understand each other well. And then in this 3 to 4 years time span is when we really start working on the transition. So this is the time to begin discussions just at the board level regarding the actual transition. So what are the potential timelines? I know at this far out, oftentimes the CEO may not know exactly what their timeline is going to be. So starting to discuss this, is it going to be 3 years from now? Is it going to be 4 years from now, 5 years from now? Where is that timeline? And then what the format is for this individual that's retiring. You asked the question, somebody asked the question before about remaining on the board after retirement. Is that something that the CEO would like to do? Is that something the board would like to have happen? Also, I've seen situations where a retired CEO may stay connected to the organization in some other way. Maybe they serve on a committee. Maybe they're even involved somehow in the business from a consulting standpoint and so forth. So what are those kind of ideal scenarios for that outgoing CEO after they retire? What then are the goals for that transition period? So if it's 3 years from today, what things do we need to do as a business to make sure that we're ready for that transition? So again, looking at transitioning of customers, transitioning of vendor relationships, all those kinds of things, community relationships, what needs to get done in that period between now and the time when that individual retires. You can begin discussing potential successors at this point. Oftentimes what I will see though is that the board, especially if you have independent directors, may not have access or understanding of what exists on the senior leadership team. So it's important that you also create access for your senior leadership team members to the board of directors. That can be in the form of them providing information to the board, presentations to the board of each functional area rotating through the year, presenting to the board. It can be if you have a committee structure, it may be that you have senior leadership team members working with board directors on a committee, on a finance committee, audit committee, nominating committee, whatever that may be. But giving those board directors access to be able to understand what is there in terms of the senior leadership team. And then very critical at this point also is in terms of your strategic plan. So if you don't have a strategic plan, building a strategic plan or revising your strategic plan, because your strategic plan is really going to drive what it is that you're looking for in your next CEO. So I want to make just a quick comment about that. I don't want to explain strategic planning to you. I'm sure you all know what that is, but looking out into the future and saying, where are we going to be as a business, and getting a solid understanding of that. Now, strategic plans often change. Things often change. We don't always end up where we think we're going to end up, and getting there sometimes is different than we think. But having a plan on where we're going is really important, as I said. And I'll get into kind of talking about how to develop that CEO profile from your strategic plan. Okay, so just as a bookmark here, just kind of where we are in the transition roadmap. So we're at this 2 to 3 year out period, and I would say that this point is actually probably where most of the work gets done. Probably most of the time that you're going to be spending as a board and as a senior leadership team and HR department is going to be in this 2 to 3 year out kind of phase. Okay, so polling question number 1. The most appropriate person to lead a CEO transition process is.
All right, everybody, you should see that first polling question live for you up on your screen. I will give everyone about a minute to answer these, or until we have at least majority participation. Don't worry too much about right or wrong. Just go ahead and submit your answer there. And if you've got a question, now's a good time to throw that in our Q&A. I haven't seen anything come through in the last few minutes. But I have 6 more folks if you'd like to answer. I'll say now's the time. I'll close this out and then I'll share out um, kind of what everybody's thinking here before we move on. Last call there. All right, let's see what we answered.
Okay. So the right answer here is B, the board of directors. And maybe I shouldn't ask it as the appropriate person because it's more than one person. But the board of directors is really driving the CEO transition process and as I mentioned before, ultimately making that decision as a group on who that next CEO is and should be. Okay. And we got polling question number 2 right away. So the best time to start planning for a CEO transition is 6 months prior, 1 year prior, or 4 to 5 years prior. I'm hoping most of you can get this one.
Okay, same as last time. I've got most of you answered here. So if you're on the fence, go ahead and take your best guess and we'll do the same, share out the results so everyone can see, but I'll do last call for this question. Hit you with a back-to-back, so hopefully you're paying attention. Looks like most people answered similarly, but I'll share these out.
Great. Terrific. Yes. Almost everyone got the right answer. So the right answer is 4 to 5 years from the transition. So that's the best time to get started on planning for your transition. I've seen it done in 6 months, but I wouldn't recommend it. Okay. Okay. So we're still at this 2 to 3 years out from the transition period. And I mentioned briefly about building your CEO profile. So one of the things that we see quite often in the work that we do with ESOPs is, when we begin a CEO search process, we will come into the organization and spend time with the senior leadership team, oftentimes with the next layer down of management as well, and sometimes even further down into some of the other employee owners. And we will ask the question of, what would you like to see in your next CEO? What do you think is the most important key skill sets, attributes, experiences? And a lot of times what we'll hear is that we want to see this a carbon copy of what we had. We love Bob. Bob has been here for 20 years and has done a fantastic job, and we like him and like him personally and respect him. And so can you find us another Bob? And we get a chance to meet Bob as well, and we agree. Bob certainly has done a fantastic job in the organization. But the truth is, the fact that Bob has done a great job in the organization has made it so that the next CEO needs to be something a little bit different. So if Bob's been there for 20 years, it's very likely that he may have came in when the organization was $10 million in revenue and 25 or so employee owners, and now the company when Bob is ready to retire is $60 million and has 200 employees. So the fact that Bob has done a great job in leading the company and growing the company along with the senior leadership team makes it that it will be a little bit different for the next CEO coming in, because a CEO that goes from 10 to 60 million is different from a CEO. The skill sets of a CEO that go from 60 million to 120 million. So one of the things that I really like to do with my clients when I have the chance, or I encourage them to do this on their own, is to do what we call an org chart of the future. So I will work with the board and do sort of a visioning exercise and say, what do we really want to be five to 7 years out. And this is where your strategic plan really comes into play. And we'll take all the names off of the current org chart. And what we'll do is build an org chart, the ideal org chart for the future. So that's 7 years out. The numbers that I was using as an example, if we're a $60 million a year company today, and we think that in 7 years we can be a $120 million a year company, we're going to build a functional org chart for the ideal functional org chart for a $120 million company. And it will be obviously structured different than what you are today. There'll be additional boxes, there'll be additional people. And then what we'll do is we'll go back and put the names, current names, back into the new org chart. And what will happen is you'll see very quickly where, we might need to add positions, where we need to develop individuals, leaders in the organization, where people's jobs will expand and so forth. And then ultimately what we can do is sort of roll up and say the CEO then of the $120 million organization needs to be able to be capable of leading a team of X amount on the senior leadership team, lead a company that has developed 30 different products, is working internationally, is et cetera, et cetera. So it really helps us define what that profile is that we're looking for that next CEO. And that's, here, build the CEO profile. So what are those key skill sets, experiences, and so forth tied to your strategic plan? And, we get there through this org chart of the future. Now that you have the CEO profile and we know what we're looking for in the next CEO, then you can start to look more closely at your internal potential successors. So this is the time, still just 2 to 3 years out from transition, where you're evaluating your current leadership team against this new CEO profile. So you're identifying potentials in the organization and you're identifying gaps as well. So there's a few different ways that you can go about this. There's assessments out there, industrial psychology assessments like the Hogan, the OmniView, DDI. There's some others that will give you an assessment of your senior leaders and kind of identify where some of those gaps may be. Also, 360-degree reviews is a good process at this point as well too. And sometimes these are done in conjunction, assessments and an assessment and 360-degree review. But the idea is to identify those gaps, because now we're still 2 to 3 years out from the actual transition. We want to have some time to be able to fill those gaps, to be able to develop some of those individuals inside, because even though I generally get paid to help organizations find candidates from the outside of the company, I still believe it's the very best to be able to hire from inside when you can. And so that's the idea here, is to do this 2 to 3 years in advance of the transition, so you can do development to help those candidates potentially get there. And as I said here, create training and development that comes out of those gaps, and then that can be a combination of things. Can be mentoring, coursework, could be a school, can be a variety of things, but depends on kind of what those gaps are. And this is where we will get the, as I mentioned before, with the developmental piece for the outgoing CEO. So oftentimes we'll get the outgoing CEO spending more time mentoring particular individuals in the organization. Also from an HR perspective, getting involved in any training and coursework and things like that would be appropriate for moving some of these leaders forward. So as we get a little bit further down the line here, now we're about a year to 18 months away from the transition. We want to evaluate our progress on internal candidates. Have we been able to close some of those gaps? Or do we really feel like an internal candidate is going to be able to step into that CEO and fills that CEO profile? It's also time to create your recruiting and hiring plan. So how are we going to go about this? Are we going to be looking at internal candidates only? Do we feel like we have strong internal candidates? Then it's a matter of choosing which one. Or are we going to look at a combination of internal and external? Or are we going to look at external candidates only? And I would say most often, when I'm involved with clients, it's an internal and external situation where we're looking at both of those. But I have seen situations where there may not be anybody inside that is ready, and it's going to be external only, and situations where there is multiple candidates inside who could be potentials, and it's a matter of choosing the very best. You also want to, at this point, build that list of goals and objectives for the outgoing CEO. So there was some early discussion in terms of what we needed to do to get the business ready from a standpoint for the next 2 to 3 years or 4 years before the transition happens. But this is a much more specific thing. What are those, now that we're 18 months away, what are those key transition items, key trainings, and relationships and so forth that need to be handed off in the organization, that we absolutely need to make sure are completed before our CEO walks out the door and to the beach or wherever they're going. This is also the time to identify what that appropriate overlap time would be between the outgoing CEO and the new CEO. So many times, we'll have that situation where we have a 4 to 6 month kind of overlap with the outgoing CEO and the new CEO coming in. But I'd say that there's not a silver bullet answer in terms of what's the right overlap time. I tend to think, something less than 2 months is probably not enough, and more than 9 months is too much, but somewhere in between there is probably a good number. And it really depends on the situation, the organization, some of those transition items and so forth. And, also depends on the individual that's chosen and what, gaps might still exist there as well for that person coming in. Okay, this one's totally unfair because I didn't talk about it. So how did I miss that, Maria? Well, so I will give you this. I'll just tell you the answer to this one because I failed to talk about it. So the question is, the best time to communicate to employee owners about a CEO transition is after you've hired the new CEO. Actually, I think this is just out of place in the presentation here. My apologies. So the best time to talk with employee owners about a CEO transition is after you have determined your exact timeline. So early on, when it's still fuzzy and it may be 3 years or it may be 4 years, it's not the time to take it to the employee owners and let everyone know that if you're the CEO, that you're planning to retire in the near term. If once you have, though, that timeline set and established, then it is a good time to let people know what's happening and let them know that there's a plan in place that you're going to be following as you go through for this transition. So
It looks like there's 11 of you. If you'd like to answer, although we know the answer and you're looking for CE, go ahead and submit your answer here as it is required. So I'll give everyone another 15-20 seconds to just submit an answer, but looks like quite a few of you got it right nonetheless. So
excellent.
good job to all of you. I'm going to close this out. So last call here. And then I'll skip the sharing out the results since we all know. All right. I'll also make a note that we're in our last half hour of our presentation time. So start thinking about your questions and throwing those there when you have them.
Okay. Thanks, Maria. So getting close now. Now we're 3 to 9 months away from the transition. Actually, this should probably say 3 to 12 months away from the transition. So in that 9 months to a year out, you need to, this is when you want to begin your recruiting or your search or hiring process. Again, you've determined whether or not this is going to be internal only, internal, external, or external only. And so figuring out how that process is going to work, if you're going to utilize a partner on that, if you're going to do it internally, how it's going to be handled, and how, if it is internal only, how are you going to conduct interviews, and who's going to be involved in those, and how does that process work? In that 3 to 6 months out, this is when you actually make the hire. And so at this point, you want to internally communicate. So again, the 3 to 6 months out is there because there's that overlap period. And so you want to make the hire, you want to internally communicate, and then also publicly announce the new CEO. Best always to communicate internally first and then make your public announcement very shortly thereafter, because people are obviously nervous as this is going on, and so making sure that you have people involved or as early as possible and communicating as early as possible to for your employee owners is important. At this point, you also want to complete your onboarding plan. So again, depending on who this person is that's coming in, there's going to be certain things that they need to learn and understand about the organization. It's going to be different if they're coming from the inside than if they are from the outside. And so what are those specific development things and assimilation needs for that new CEO coming into the company? And that can be things like meeting with all the employee owners, meeting with customers and clients. It can be even some educational development, things like that, that maybe that needs to be done to make sure that this person can assimilate nicely into the organization. Also includes working closely with the board of directors and making sure that that relationship gets off on a good foot as well. So, unfortunately, a lot of times we go through this process when that hire is made, when the offer is accepted, everybody breathes a sigh of relief and feels like, oh, it's all done. It's not all done because it's not just about putting somebody into the chair. As I mentioned, you need to have make sure that you're assimilating that person into the organization and making sure that they're getting off on the right foot. And when they do that, it's going to make their long-term success much more likely. So, 30, 60, 90 days after and 1 year after the hire. So you want to be executing upon that onboarding plan, making tweaks to that plan as necessary as you go. Have very intentional and additional communication with board directors, potential coaching and development work, and then continuing on and ongoing communication with your employee owners. That first 6 months in particular is just absolutely critical in how a new CEO gets into an organization and builds trust throughout the organization. So it's really important on that communication piece that's happening in that first 6 months while they're there. So just as kind of a wrap up, just some do's and don'ts. Do's. So get started as early as possible. There's a great saying in the environmental world that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is right now. So if you're not started, if you haven't started some of these activities, just get started. That's the most important thing. Communicate as you go. So obviously communication with the board, communication with your senior leadership team, communication with your employee owners. Anytime a CEO transition is happening, employee owners are naturally going to be anxious. As I mentioned early on, your CEO is so tied into everything that a company does that people are anxious about it. So you need to be communicating what's happening. Of course, at the appropriate time, the board is going to know first, senior leadership team will be next, and then the employee owners will. You should be communicating with them once you know the exact timeline for the transition. And don'ts are really just kind of the opposite. Don't wait too long wherever you are. Get started. Don't skip the background work. So don't make sure that you have a strong board in place. Make sure that you have a strong succession committee or transition committee on the board, and you have good folks that are involved on that committee. Make sure you go through your strategic planning, and many of you probably have a strategic plan already, but tweaking that plan and making sure that that plan really makes sense for the next 5 to 10 years. And then you and your team evaluations. Make sure that you are looking at your individuals that are potential candidates for the role and doing those evaluations. Don't be passive. Oftentimes I've heard CEOs say, I'm not going to let people know until I'm really close to retirement because I don't want to make people nervous or anxious. If you are if you are nearing retirement age, people are thinking about that already. Maybe this comes into the assume bucket here. Don't assume that people know and don't assume that people don't know. So um, please communicate, as I said, in an appropriate fashion and let people know what's happening. And from a board perspective, last thing I'll say, and from a board perspective, it is the board members' highest responsibility to make sure the right CEO is in place. So if you're a board director, don't be afraid to discuss transition. Sometimes it's a difficult thing to bring up, but again, when CEO is nearing retirement age, it's time to start talking about that because if we wait too long and that transition doesn't go well, it can really do damage to the ESOP and to the company. So don't be afraid to bring this up in board meetings and to discuss the situation because it's one of the biggest things that you do as a board director is to make sure you got that right CEO in place at all times. So just back to the overall roadmap, and then I'd like to take any questions.
It looks like there was one question in the chat that came from Patrick, asking, in an ESOP company, is it important to field a minimum number of candidates, some internal, some outside, in order to meet the duties of care and loyalty, or is it just most important to document, document, and document?
That's a great question. Um, I do think it's important to look at a variety of candidates. I think it's important, though, that you're looking at candidates who are at least minimally qualified. You don't want to bring in just candidates into the process just so that you have a number of them to look at. I think I've not heard it put that way before. It's put into sort of duty of care and how many people you would look at in a CEO search process. But I think it actually does, it falls into that category that as a board, um, you're, as I said multiple times here, your top responsibility is to make sure you have the right CEO in place. So, having a process where you're looking at multiple candidates makes a lot of sense. And so very astute question.
Okay, we have another 8 minutes here, so I encourage your questions as you feel things that are coming up, things you're thinking about. I'm going to share out the link for everybody to today's page. I'll note also you'll get a follow-up email from us later today. And that follow-up will have the replay, the slides, some contact info, the survey, all the things you might need to follow up from today. So make sure you're keeping an eye on your email so that you don't miss that come through. One question that came through from James is, what is the typical term of a CEO?
Yeah, a good question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer that perfectly. There's some national data out there about CEOs that would say CEOs stay somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 4.5 years. I in ESOPs, in my experience with ESOPs, it's much longer than that. And I couldn't give you an exact number, but it's much longer than 4.5 years. And I think that has to do with, the cultural components of an ESOP and how important culture is to ESOPs. And, that CEO is really driving that culture and a champion for that culture. And so when they're in the company and it's the right fit for them and it's the right fit for the company, there's really no reason to be moving on after just a few years. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, what other questions do folks have before we wrap up too preemptively? Do you have anything you'd like to share on characteristic traits? Things to keep your eye out for if you're on the hunt?
Sure. One thing I would like to just bring up. I'm curious, and you don't have to say necessarily in the audience here, but if you are in a position where you are replacing an owner versus a hired CEO, so to speak. So if you've gone through an ESOP transaction and your owner is the CEO and is now retiring, I think there's some additional things that go along with that. And I believe that the communication piece is even more important when it's an owner because they are so connected and the company is their baby. And it's also difficult for an owner to go through that process, and there's a lot of emotion involved and things as well. So again, having going back to kind of the very beginning here of the presentation, having a strong board of directors with at least a couple of independent directors on the board who can help that owner founder through that process is really important. And we can see it sometimes with sort of long-term CEOs with ESOPs as well, because it's a very difficult thing to go through. And that's one of the reasons also that I don't suggest it's a good idea that your outgoing CEO, sort of handpicking your next CEO, because there's a lot of things that they're going through and at that point, and sort of unfair to ask them to do that.
All right, I will let us linger here for a minute or two. Um, but it looks like folks are pretty settled with their questions here. So if you have anything you'd like to wrap up with, I will give you the space and time to do so now. But from our standpoint, thank you for everyone spending an hour with us on your Tuesday. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the chance to talk with you today. Thank you for being here.
We will look forward to seeing you all in future webinars and future NCEO events.
And if anybody has any other questions that you didn't want to ask today, feel free to reach out to me anytime, or email or phone.
All right, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you.